Well, Ben Franta is the Leslie Parker Hume Graduate Fellow at Stanford University, where he studies the history of climate disinformation, denial, and delay. Ben Franta, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
So, what got you interested in studying climate disinformation in the first place?
Yeah, I actually stumbled into this area accidentally. So most of my background was in physics, and I used to study solar energy. I did a PhD in applied physics, studying solar energy. I was really interested in climate change, doing what I could to fight climate change. And by the end of that PhD, I came to believe that the bottleneck to dealing with climate change was not technological, but that it was political in nature. And so I shifted gears. I decided to do another PhD in history, studying the history of climate politics. And my main question was, what has held back action so much on climate change? And so, I started investigating, okay, what have been the activities of the fossil fuel industry? I looked at their trade associations like the American Petroleum Institute, which is the main trade association for the whole oil and gas industry, and uncovering what they knew decades ago, their early knowledge. What did they know in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s? And then what did they tell people about climate change later? So I got really interested in this, and I got really lucky because my advisor here at Stanford University is a historian of the tobacco industry. So he spent, decades studying the history of big tobacco and what they knew, what they told people, and that sort of supercharged my own investigation, because they used a lot of the same tactics. They used, sometimes it was even the same people and groups that were helping both industries to confuse people about their products. So, that it all came together. And just one final note, which is that around that same time, this is around 2016 or so, when I started doing this, that's when a bunch of climate change lawsuits started to be filed or investigated to be filed based on the industry's history of knowledge and deception. And so I saw, okay, not only is this intellectually interesting, but also this can be very impactful as well, in the court of law, but also in the court of public opinion, just our understanding of, how we got to where we are today.
And we're going to get into that disinformation and denial and deception a little bit later in the conversation. But first, I do want to talk about some of the work you did as a student while you were getting your first PhD. I know that you were part of the fossil fuel divest Harvard campaign while you were a student there. And yesterday, Harvard announced that they would not be making any new investments in fossil fuels and would let the ones that they have currently expire. So how did that announcement make you feel?
Well, I saw, this letter from the president of Harvard, and it seemed like sort of one of those generic public relations type announcements. And I was sort of reading through it, and I saw that part, and it said, we don't have any more direct investments in fossil fuels. We don't plan on making any more. It said it was, I think, imprudent, financially, to invest in fossil fuels and, for the sake of the whole world. And yeah, I saw that. I was like, did they just quietly announce divestment? And then, and throughout the day, people sort of noticed that. And today, this was yesterday. So today, it's big news. I just saw a story in the Washington Post, I think NPR, it's major news. And it's so big because when I started helping with the divestment movement, this is back in 2012, so almost 10 years ago, we were told that we were crazy. we were told that we just didn't know what we were talking about, that we were stupid. I would have these like really like well-heeled Harvard alums, in their like expensive suits walk by, and they would yell at us and say, go back to the Stone Age. Things like that. And, we were really derided as being crazy. It was also hard because I was a scientist, and there's a culture within science, basically not to acknowledge or get involved with anything political. I think, this is a mistake. It's a confusion between objectivity and neutrality, where people think, oh, if I want to be objective, it means I have to be neutral. But in reality, if there's a disaster occurring, the objective thing to do is not to be neutral. It's to try to avoid a disaster. So, it was hard for many reasons. It took a lot of effort, and a lot of people put a lot on the line to support this. And so I'm kind of amazed, that it's finally happened. It's like the unthinkable became possible, and now it's inevitable. And just to see Harvard finally acknowledge that. Of course, they did it quietly. They wanted to save face. But for them to finally acknowledge that it shows that things are changing.
Why do you think this succeeded?
I think it succeeded because they saw that their position ultimately is a losing one. There are structural changes that are occurring to do with climate change. And the whole position of the fossil fuel industry is declining on multiple fronts over time. The question is not if that will happen or whether it's happening. The question is, how fast is it happening? And so, movements like the divestment movement, they accelerate that process. And, I think finally Harvard just said, this isn't worth the headache of staking out a bad position. And this issue is not going to go away. It's just going to become more and more intense over time. So, I'm glad that they finally came to their senses, at least somewhat.
Sure. I mean, fossil fuels are a bad investment now. I mean, do you think that the divestment campaigns like this would have been successful if fossil fuel companies were still valuable assets?
It's a really good question. I think that fossil fuel companies are massively overvalued currently. And I mean, I want to be totally clear. I'm not a financial expert. I mean, I barely have any savings. I've been in grad school for like over a decade. But if you just think about the fundamentals, these companies have resources on their books that they can never use if we actually hold global warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, at a bad but less than completely catastrophic level, hopefully. At the same time, all of their human resources, their core expertise is in fossil fuels. It's on getting things out of the ground, usually pumping fluids out of the ground and transporting fluids through pipes, and then doing chemical engineering on them to turn them into fuels and then delivering them. So that's not energy overall. These are not diversified energy companies. They're fossil fuel companies, they're petrochemical companies. So, I think for those reasons, their outlook is not good. And so what their strategy is to try to delay the inevitable, try to delay their decline and hold on to the market as long as they can. And, I think we've just been seeing more and more people, including in the financial sector. And I'm talking about hardcore, ruthless capitalists who want to make a lot of money. I think they're also recognizing that this sector's, the fossil fuel industry, is massively overvalued. And I think some of them smell blood in the water. And they think they can also make money by accelerating the demise of the fossil fuel industry. That's a different conversation, but I think the position of the industry is not a strong one, and they're just trying to hang on for as long as they can.
Yeah, they're doing everything they can to slow that inevitable demise. And we've had Naomi Oreskes on here, we've had Amy Westervelt, and so many others on the Climate Pod talking about the lies that fossil fuel companies have spread for decades about the causes and the severity of global warming. From your research, why do you think the fossil fuel industry has been so effective at executing this strategy?
Well, I think they operate on many fronts. Why are they effective? They use something very effectively called the third party technique. Now, the third party technique is an idea that was developed or, kind of formalized all the way back in like the 1920s by one of the creators of modern PR, Edward Bernays. He talks about this in one of his books. It's a book called Propaganda. And he talks about using the third party technique. And his point is that if you want somebody to believe something, you shouldn't tell them directly. You should have other parties tell them, trusted parties. You want to have your target audience hear something from many directions at the same time, many different directions, and you yourself can step back and become invisible. That's how you influence their thinking. And he called this the third party technique. And so the fossil fuel industry has been really effective at doing this. Using scientists as spokespeople, especially back in the 1990s, using scientists to say, oh, climate science is uncertain. One of my recent papers is about economists and how fossil fuel industry funded a relatively small group of economists to write study after study saying climate action is too expensive. And then that message would get broadcast to the public without mentioning that it had been funded by the industry or that these economists had worked for the industry for many years. And, I tried to pull the hood back, pull back the curtain on those economic models, and they have built-in assumptions that create that outcome, that result, that this is too expensive. So it's the only answer you can get with those models. And so, it's a pretty simple strategy if you think about it. Fund people who are going to come up with the answer that you want, and then tell people that, look, I'm not telling you, they're telling you. Right? So, they've done that. They've tons of distraction techniques like blaming the consumer, focusing on changing your light bulbs. These things are fine in a sort of micro sense. I mean, it's good to not be wasteful, of course, but it distracted from the fact that we still have to replace fossil fuels as rapidly as possible, this structural issue. Promoting solutions like methane gas, natural gas, and things like hydrogen, which is mostly made out of methane gas, things like carbon capture, which the industry has considered carbon capture even from the early 80s to deal with climate change. But the problem is it's too expensive compared to renewables, which are getting cheaper all the time. So there are all of these distraction techniques that divert attention away from what ultimately has to be done, which is replace fossil fuels. So they've been very effective. And also I want to mention that the industry has pervasively inserted itself into the scientific process as well. And I always try to be careful when I talk about this, because I don't want to cast aspersions on any scientists. But the fact is that the fossil fuel industry has been funding a huge amount of the academic work, just like it funded those economic consultants I mentioned earlier, a huge amount of the academic work related to climate change. So the public depends on this research to find the solutions to climate change but it's dependent on the blessing, and continued approval of the fossil fuel industry for continued funding. So that has been a massive conflict of interest that exists at, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia University, all over the place. And that really accelerated in the early 2000s, in the last few decades, that those funding arrangements have become more pervasive. And so, now I think we're going to have to take a look at that too, and decide, okay, is this actually what we want? But do we want the equivalent of like Philip Morris funding our public health research? Or is there a better way to do this?
Yeah, I want to dig in on that recent paper that you just published. The paper is called Weaponizing Economics, Big Oil, Economic Consultants, and Climate Policy Delay. And the paper tells the story of Charles River Associates, this economic firm that was hired by American Petroleum Industry, like you said, to produce these reports that favored basically not implementing policies that might reduce fossil fuel use. So what made you want to focus on the economists behind this climate misinformation?
Yeah, this is another example of just stumbling on something through serendipity. This is like 4 years ago. I had downloaded off of a newspaper database every news article that mentioned the American Petroleum Institute, which is the main trade association for the oil industry, and things like global warming or climate change. And it's thousands of articles going all the way back to the 80s. And I sorted them in chronological order, and I just began to read them. It took like this week is just reading these articles. So a lot of time, but you get the blow by blow. You see who are the people involved, what are the messaging, what are the talking points that they're using, when do things change, and so on. So I was doing that, and I kept noticing, okay, the industry is promoting doubt about climate science by quoting some of these scientists that we've known for a long time were, funded by the industry. But they were also quoting these economists to say that it's too expensive to act. And I started to notice that it was the same economists again and again over years of time, starting in the early 90s. And so I thought this is really interesting historically. Then, I saw on TV or the internet that at the time, President Trump, he gave a speech, I think in the Rose Garden. He announced that the US was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And to support his decision, he cited some economic statistics about how much it's going to cost, your average American family, how much it's going to cost the GDP, and so on. I thought this is a little bit weird because, those parts of the Paris Agreement about cutting emissions, they weren't even binding in the first place. So I thought it was weird that there would be a study like this. So I tracked down that economic study, and the authors were the same people that I had been seeing doing this work back in the 90s. And I thought, oh my gosh, this isn't just a historical issue, but it's still ongoing. It's still ongoing today. So I thought, okay, first of all, people need to know about this. And second of all, I became very interested in, tracking all the activities of this group just as a starting point. And, so, that was sort of the genesis of the study. But I think what I want to emphasize is that I focused on this group because they were so obvious. Like they just kind of kept coming up again and again. But they weren't alone. A lot of, again, the academic climate economics centers in the United States, they use similar methodologies as this group. So, and those groups too, those academic groups are also funded by the oil industry. So, I think that there's a huge question about, are there certain economic paradigms? Are there certain economic modeling approaches that only give you one kind of an answer that the oil industry has been amplifying? by funding certain people, by funding certain groups that model in this way, so that it becomes dominant in the climate economics space. And, this feeds into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change directly and so on. So I think the influence has probably been pretty pervasive. And this paper about the Charles River Associates, they're just one example, but I think that's the opening point. That's the entry point for getting into this bigger issue of, what has been the industry's influence over climate economics for decades.
So what were these reports claiming that would eventually lead to defeat for basically anything that was proposed to reduce fossil fuel use over the last 30 years?
Yeah. So if you look at the basic approach that these models have, they assume that how things are right now is optimal. That's just an assumption about the way the world works and the way the economy works. And it's actually, that goes back to the 1800s when neoclassical economics was developed. And that assumption, is pretty unscientific because you can't test it. It's merely an assumption about the way things are, that if you leave a market alone, it's going to find the best solution. So that's the starting point. So then anything you do after that is going to cost money, is the result of that assumption. Then the question is, how much money is it going to cost? Well, the way these economists modeled, getting off of fossil fuels, they built in more assumptions that inflated the cost of action, like assuming that renewable energy would always be really expensive, even like 100 years into the future, which already that's not true. But they made that assumption. And so of course, the result you get is that this is really expensive. Then looking at the benefit side, well, how much do we gain from this action? What would be the damages from climate change itself? That wasn't even addressed. That was completely ignored. So of course, if you understand the basic approach, you come to realize that this is the only answer you can get with this model, is that it's going to be really expensive, right? You're not even looking at the benefit side. So it was like rinse and repeat. You could, fund these people to do this model. You know what they do. They delivered in the past. Let's hire them again. And every time some sort of a climate policy would arise in the United States, and this was all the way back in the early 90s, that people were trying to put, some sort of a price on carbon or legislation to get away from fossil fuels. Every time that would happen, or every time there'd be an international climate meeting, the industry would hire these economists to pump out another study saying the same thing, and it would get broadcast, in the New York Times. It would get, broadcast to Congress and congressional testimony, and it sort of just became conventional wisdom after a while that climate action is like really expensive, even though it was based on these like really problematic, shoddy in a lot of ways, these models. So that's basically how they worked.
Well, and their influence is just it's so widespread. And you talked about this, right? It's not just domestic policy that they were influencing. Their work was presented on the international stage. So how did their work influence these international agreements?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the big battlegrounds kind of early on, in the 90s was the Kyoto Protocol. That's when the nations in the world are like, okay, we're going to create an international climate treaty that's binding. It says, you have to do this. And, these economists played a role in weakening that, for sure. They would go to these international climate meetings. They would share their results with people from all around the world saying, this is going to hurt your GDP, your economy by this much. Did you know that? What about your country? Well, it's going to hurt it this much. Did you know that? And so it just created this whole idea that it was going to be economically devastating to pursue a climate treaty. And of course, the Kyoto Protocol kind of partly went forward. The United States withdrew from that process, and it doesn't seem to have made a massive difference. It kind of implemented a kind of weak cap and trade type program. But you know, it's like if we take the big view, we look back 30 years, it's like the UN tried to start this process like 30 years ago, you know, like 3 decades ago. And what do we have to show for it? The problem is that sort of delay is itself the damage. That's the damage. It's different from other problems because there is an irreversible penalty for waiting. So taking a long time to figure things out, like, well, we'll get this international climate treaty figured out, you know, 5 years from now or in the next decade. Like waiting that long has a massive irreversible penalty because the impacts of global warming are, a lot of them are irreversible. So we have seen actually unbelievable levels of just slowing things down and delay so that now, you know, I mean, it's 30 years later and now we really have to move quickly in order to avoid really serious catastrophe, I think.
Yeah, we've got a huge international, agreement or no negotiations coming up in less than 2 months. We've got COP26. I mean, are you seeing fossil fuel sponsored analyses like this pop up now in preparation for COP26?
I haven't seen in particular, but I think these sorts of analyses are still, they're still occurring. I mean, because, and why do I say that? Because this has been the regular course of business, you know, for decades, and it hasn't changed. It's been working for the industry, and in a way, you know, the industry has inserted its worldview, its preferred way of doing things, you know, into the mainstream in some ways. You know, I talked about the academic climate economists who inform the IPCC. I mean, they're using these industry preferred methodologies themselves. So we have to look at this area. I hate saying we have to do something because I think people should make their own decisions about what they think needs to be done. But you know, we have a situation where the whole fate of the future of the world is depending on what we do now. Like in the next, you know, 5 or 10 years will make a big difference for thousands of years. So we really have to look at every way that makes us less effective at solving the problem. We have to look at that. You know, if the fact that the fossil fuel industry has been funding these studies for decades and presumably influencing them, at least by selecting what it likes to fund and what it doesn't like to fund, well, then we have to look at that because, you know, literally centuries of humanity are depending on us being able to do that now. So that's my pitch for taking a closer look at this.
And you found that information not through some like secret treasure trove that you stumbled upon at a garage sale or something like that. This is publicly available information. And why do you think the connection between API and Charles River Associates was never exposed, or at least used to dispute these reports, or at least argue against those that were using these reports as a way of delaying climate policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's like one of the mysteries, right? It's a mystery of history, as I like to call them. It's like, how come this wasn't noticed earlier? And I think the fact was that some people did notice earlier. You know, there were a few people who said, hey, wait a second, you know, these models are designed to come up with their outcome and they're funded by the industry, but they weren't listened to. You know, they were largely ignored. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift in the zeitgeist. We're seeing a shift in the overall public consciousness around how do we define climate change as a problem. Whereas for years, it was defined as a technical problem, sort of ignoring the political realities of it. And now we're starting to see, oh, actually, there's been huge amounts of political machination occurring for decades. Once we're aware of that, then we start to look in that direction, and then we begin to see what has been going on. But you don't see it unless you think to look for it. And that's one of the facts, I think, just about the human experience is like, there's an infinite number of things to perceive and to try to investigate, and we can only ever do a thin slice, like a faint trace of the past that we'll understand. And so I think we're shifting our attention collectively as a society towards the fossil fuel industry as being one of the major reasons why progress has been so slow. And so now it's become a very fruitful shift in focus, because now we are seeing there's a lot there. And I think it's also just the beginning of what we're going to find out, because in the last 5 years there haven't been that many people like researching this area, but already we found a huge amount. So I think, and then I think there's a huge amount more to be found. Just the tip of the iceberg so far, I think.
Yeah, I mean, paying attention is key. Last year, I spoke to Kurt Anderson about his book Evil Geniuses, and one of the most infuriating themes of the book was just how out in the open this neoliberal plan and strategy to take over American politics and economic thought was. And when I read your paper, I thought the exact same thing, because you cite this excerpt from this industry handbook called The Regulation Game, which is published back in 1978. And it says, regulatory policy is increasingly made with the participation of experts, especially academics. A regulated firm or industry should be prepared whenever possible to co-opt these experts. This is most effectively done by identifying the leading experts in each relevant field and hiring them as consultants or advisors, or giving them research grants and the like. I mean, when you found that passage, how did you feel?
I was like, this is so straightforward. I mean, because one thing I study is the broader history of, the corruption of science and the manipulation of science by moneyed interests, by different industries. I mentioned my advisory studies, the tobacco industry, they did the same thing. They had something called Operation Whitecoat, which was to co-opt an international cohort of scientists who could be spokespeople and tell the public that, well, the links between tobacco and cigarettes and disease are, uncertain and such things like that. So lots of industries have done this. It's this sort of become a standard technique. The problem is often the experts themselves don't realize they've been influenced. They often don't understand the mechanism of influence, because it's not just that when you take money from the fossil fuel industry, you become dependent on them in part for your livelihood, and therefore it's going to change your thinking, it's going to change your behavior, what you're willing to say in public and what you're not. But also there's a sociological influence. And by that, I mean the industry surveys the field of experts. And of course, there's diversity within views of, for many reasons, ideological reasons, or just different reasons. And so the industry can selectively amplify certain views by choosing who to fund and who not to fund. And so someone getting funding can honestly say, well, I didn't change my mind because I got this funding. I thought this before. And they're missing the bigger picture, which is that you got this funding because that's what you think. And if you take a bigger view, what the industry is doing is they're amplifying certain views and not others. And that shifts the center of gravity in the whole discussion in their preferred direction. And so, it's actually very simple when you think about it. And that's one reason why I think climate scientists or energy policy people, they need to understand that it's not just whether their individual view was altered which, by the way, through decades of like psychological research, we know that actually people's minds are altered when they receive money and stuff like that from a patron. But it's the bigger problem of, okay, now you're allowing the industry to select who gets a bigger, megaphone and who doesn't. And that industry has a massive, existential conflict of interest with solving climate change. So that's not a very good idea. So I think there has to be some level of a new professional ethics, a new conflict of interest, professional ethics within climate research about who do you take money from and who do you not. And, this is kind of late. I mean, we probably should have done this 30 years ago, but better late than never.
And you actually had the opportunity to speak with one of those economists at Charles River Associates. Was he cognizant of the influence that the API had over their methodology or their findings?
I think it's complicated, and I hate saying that because it sounds like a cop out. I don't want to speak for him. He was, a consultant for this group for many years. But I think also he's very worried about climate change now. And I think, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think perhaps he, is looking back on the influence that he had on the big picture, and he wants to, be honest and sort of do what he can to set things right. So, that's sort of my perception, but it was incredibly helpful to have him speak forthrightly about his work, to get the inside view, to understand the, sort of psychology. I think, one part of it is, well, if I don't do this, somebody else is going to do this. Or President Trump just cited that because he needed an excuse. But of course, if you give someone an excuse, you're still helping them. You're still helping them to do that thing. So, I think we need more people like him who worked with the industry or for it, either directly or indirectly, who are now, willing to step up and share their experience, talk about, what were the dynamics like. He mentioned at one point that he thought, yeah, they're funding our research because they like the results that we're giving them, so they're going to keep funding it. And that was very honest. So a lot of people have worked, with the fossil fuel industry over the years. It's a massive operation. Think about all of their PR people, the biggest PR firms in the world, like Edelman and others. And we need them, to come forward for the sake of like humanity and be forthright about what happened and, their role, so that we can change course. That's the ultimate goal, is to change our direction away from catastrophe and towards, something much healthier.
You talked about this a little bit at the top of the conversation, but earlier this year, you gave a TED Talk and you published another paper about your findings, suggesting that the API was running these misinformation campaigns even earlier than previously thought. So what did you find there?
Yeah, this was another archival find. One part of the history of disinformation is to figure out, okay, when did their disinformation effort begin? So we know that by the end of the 1950s, the oil industry had been warned about the eventuality of global warming from fossil fuels. In the 60s, the American Petroleum Institute hired their own private consultant scientists to do some research about pollution, and those scientists also warned the industry about global warming. So now they're getting more warnings. And by 1980 or so, there were really sophisticated internal research programs at Exxon. We know there was something monitoring climate science at Shell. We know that within the American Petroleum Institute, they had a whole task force that was set up to monitor all the climate science that was being done outside. So they were really well informed. They really were, but they were pretty quiet in public. So this has led to sort of a debate about, oh, were they trying to solve climate change and then they changed their mind later? Because it was until later, like 1989 or so, that the industry really became outspoken about denying climate science. But what I found was this document, this public policy book from 1980, put out by the American Petroleum Institute, and they were trying to influence public policy. At that time, there was a big debate raging about, well, what do you do about things like synthetic fuels, meaning liquid fuels that are made from coal? Should we expand coal production? And some of the oil companies were interested in this too, because they could get into the synthetic fuel business. And so this policy book was, basically said, look, there's no problem with expanding coal. We can triple coal production worldwide within the next 10, 20 years. It's fine. There are basically no bad outcomes. While at the same time, their internal documents were saying business as usual is going to create global catastrophe, by, the middle of the 21st century. So totally inconsistent. So, science, and I think of history like science. It's always like you develop a better and clearer understanding as you go. That it appears from the very, very earliest public mentions of climate change by the fossil fuel industry, they were already on their, downplay it track. They were already on their ignore the bad parts for us track. And that was misleading, of course, to the public. So, there may not have been a point in time when climate policy and the public's understanding of the issue was not polluted by misinformation from the industry. That may have been true, from the very earliest times, even from 1980 or so. So I think it's just another piece of information that just shows, look, this industry has been lying to people for decades, like since this became an issue. And, we have to be really, really skeptical of what they're telling us today, and this is a different, sort of discussion, but, now the industry is trying to promote things like hydrogen, which is mostly made from natural gas, methane gas, promoting things like carbon capture, which I mentioned earlier, natural, more methane gas, things like that. They're promoting these solutions, which are helpful for them, but we have to be extremely skeptical. We have to put the burden on them because they have been lying for decades and they have business interests in selling more and more fossil fuels. So they have to prove that, what they're saying is legitimate and not just a smokescreen.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, the study of this is still pretty young, but yet you've discovered so much. But do you think that this is all indicative of something even larger? Is there more out there defined?
I think, yeah, I think there's a lot more out there to find. I mean, well, think about tobacco. In the history of tobacco, nobody really knew that the industry had this really sophisticated understanding of disease, addiction, things like that. That they were fine tuning the design of their cigarettes to maximize addiction. And it was only through some whistleblowers, just a few people, that some of the early documents got out. Then through litigation, something like 15 million more documents were obtained, and now we know there's a massive history of deception there. Now, will the same thing happen in fossil fuels? I don't know, but so far it's just been a few people going around to archives, interviewing people and finding documents, and we've already found a huge amount. So, I want to understand, there's a lot more there. I mentioned this thing in 1989 called the Global Climate Coalition. This was something put together by the fossil fuel industry and, petrochemical industry, auto industry. And it denied climate science for basically the whole decade. And it was very effective at fighting climate policies. Well, you don't create something like that without some paper. You don't coordinate amongst dozens of companies without writing some stuff down, right? Without paying people. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot more there. There's a lot more to find. I hope we find it.
Well, there's so many incredibly talented and hardworking people that are focused on this. I mean, we've got the Exxon New movement, we've got the Drill
Mhm.
podcasts, all the great work that's been done by Naomi Oreskes, Eric Conway, Jeffrey Supron, you, and so many others. But how well do you think the awareness is among the general public, not just the people that are really
Mhm.
focused on climate, but the general public, is that fossil fuel companies knew about climate change and worked to run these misinformation campaigns?
I think that awareness is growing. It seems to be a fact that when people learn about it, they don't forget. It's because no one likes to be lied to. And so I think that this fact is salient. It's important to people across the political spectrum. They don't like to be tricked. And the fact that the oil industry had this knowledge, knew it was going to create a disaster, and went ahead and did it anyway, and then lied to people and blocked the action that people were trying to take to avoid the catastrophe. I don't think people like that. So I think this awareness is growing. And I try not to like be a futurist or predict the future, but I mean, one can only imagine. Look, 50 years from now, we know climate change, we're just getting started. What we've seen so far, we're just getting started. It's going to be worse. And people are going to know who to blame in large part for this. There is a lot of blame to go around, but you can't overlook the fossil fuel industry, the ones profiting directly off the problem, who went out of their way to deceive people. I mean, in a sense, deception became their business model. Deception became their business model because had they been honest, their industry would have not existed the way it does today. Had they been honest in 1980, had they said, look, we've been studying this is a huge problem, and if we want to avoid catastrophe, we need to act right now. So we're coordinating with government, we're coordinating amongst the industry, which we know they have the capacity to do, and we're going to try to all move away from fossil fuels because this is a big problem for the human species and everything else on Earth. They could have done that. They didn't do that. In the 90s, they could have stepped back and let other people act, put forth legislation to help fix the problem. They didn't do that. They went out of their way to block that. So that history is going to be known because that history will still matter in 50 years. It's still going to matter in 100 years because people will still be facing the fallout from those decisions that the industry made. So, I think, I mean, you be the judge of what's going to happen to the industry and how people are going to perceive it in the future. But I don't think it's going to be good. I don't think the industry is in a good position, historically speaking.
So you're at Stanford studying for both your JD and your PhD in climate disinformation. And how do you combine these two areas of interest?
Yeah. Well, so, when I started this, I was just doing history. I was interested in, what's the history of the fossil fuel industry? And I didn't really know what I was going to find. I was interested in, okay, what's the role of ideology and what's the role of the moneyed interest and how do they interact? And what I found was that often you see ideological groups, it might be an ideological think tank or a seemingly grassroots group. But if you keep investigating, you find that they're actually funded by the moneyed interests. So, I think what often happens is, you have lots of different ideologies in society, and the industry just does the same thing that I mentioned earlier. They find the ones that are useful to them and they just pump them with money. They amplify them so that becomes a dominant ideology. And Anyway, so around that time, I was studying this history, and a bunch of these climate change lawsuits started to be filed, and they were based on this history of deception. So I thought this is super interesting, first of all, because I think this has the potential to be a paradigm shifting development, similar to how fossil fuel divestment movement, when it started 2010, 2012, that was a paradigm shifting movement because it put attention on the fossil fuel industry, which today seems obvious, but at the time was seen as radical. And like almost like you had to be like hopelessly naive in order to think that moneyed interests might impede progress on replacing their business. But now it's sort of like that's obvious. But that was a paradigm shifting movement also because it was a moral movement. And so that expanded the whole community of people who could be engaged with climate change beyond the scientists. So it's not just a technical thing, it's a moral thing, and every human has moral legitimacy to have their view about what should be done. So that was a paradigm shifting movement. And I think that the legal action addressing the disinformation directly is also paradigm shifting. So that's a long way of saying that that's why I decided to do a law degree too, because I thought, the law has incredible power to really help save the planet. What the law does in the next decade is going to have a major impact for thousands of years. So I think that's also, it's a huge area, and I think we need more lawyers who are interested in putting their talents and their time towards solving this problem. There's already a lot of really great ones that are doing that, but I think we need even more.
Well, I'm so glad that you have put your talents and your time toward solving this problem. You've already uncovered, so much great stuff and produced so much great work. And I am very much looking forward to following your career and all the work that you're doing. So for our audience, where can they follow you and your work online?
You can follow me on Twitter. It's at Ben Franta. I also put all of my writing on my LinkedIn, which I kind of like LinkedIn because it's like the least addictive social media network. And I think there's like a huge problem with like intentionally addictive digital products today. But so I put all my writing on there too. So you can also see it all there there's links so you can see it all.
Well, we will definitely link to your Twitter, your LinkedIn, and that the TED Talk that you gave earlier this year. Ben Franta, thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.